The Organic System Plan, or OSP, is the foundation of the organic certification process for any farm. There are key pieces of information that are legally required to be delivered to the certifier in order for them to assess compliance. A certifier can ask anything that they decide they need about the organic operation according to the law. Nothing is proprietary in organic with respect to what the certifier can know about the operation. So, let's take a quick look at subpart 205-201 that describes the anatomy of the OSP. Part 205-201 is one of the sections that all consultants and farmers should be really familiar with. This section spells out in detail what's required to be in the Organic System Plan. Furthermore, certifiers assess overall compliance through a two-step process using the OSP. First, they review the written Organic System Plan and check for any potential noncompliances. Then, they send an inspector out to verify that the practices observed on-site are actually what's written in the plan. Any practice observed on-site that was not disclosed in the OSP is considered a noncompliance, so it's incredibly important to take the time to fill out the OSP carefully and accurately. The regulations state exactly what has to go into the OSP, but generally, we can put the elements of the OSP into about 5 buckets. First one, listing all the substances used in an operation. 2, a description of practices and procedures that are going to be performed on the farm. 3, a description of the record keeping and how you'll keep track of everything that you do on the certified organic farm. 4, a description of how you protect the organic integrity of the crop from things like pesticide drift, commingling, and contamination. 5, any additional information that the certifier feels they need to accurately assess the farm's compliance. Now you might be asking, I change things on my farm all the time. That's farming. How am I supposed to stay in compliance if I have to keep the OSP constantly up to date? The OSP is a living document and can be updated at any time. The key is that when you plan to change something, you need to update the OSP so the certifier knows, in writing, what's coming before you implement the practice. So let's get into the pieces of the OSP and where we can look. Here I have an example OSP. Based on the certifier, all OSPs look a little bit different, but they ultimately ask the same questions. By listing out the questions in exhaustive detail, the certifier ensures that they're able to confirm a farm applying for certification is indeed in compliance with all parts of the Organic Foods Production Act. Operation Profile. We get started here with the Operation Profile. The certifier needs to know what type of crops are going to be raising. Give a little bit of a narrative description of your farm and confirm your business information. So let's go through it. Here we're going to be asked, are we an organic operation or a split operation? For this example, we're a split operation. We have organic and non-organic crops, so we're going to check that. The second question, check the boxes that apply to your farming operation. Do we raise field crops, livestock, tree fruit? In this example, we just raise field crops. We're going to be raising grain. And then give a brief description of your farming operation. Question 3. So we raise certified organic cereal grains, row crops, legume forages, and pasture. Do we have any land changes? Now, we're assuming that we're a first-time applicant to organics, and so we're going to check, no, we don't, because we're a first-time applicant. And do you have a copy of the National Organic Standards? We have to, because we need to know what's in there if we're going to be applying for certification. So one part of the OSP that's going to be unique to a new applicant is going to be the production profile, but for new applicants. So they ask, are we a new applicant applying for certification? That's a yes. Have you previously applied for certification? On the whole, we're going to say no to that because this is our first time applying for certification. If the answer were yes, that we're actually transferring, we're not considered a new client and we want to disclose all of the information about our previous certifier. If we're currently certified by another certifier, we need to disclose that as well. Have we ever been denied certification? If that's the case, that we've applied to someone else, another certifier, been denied, then we need to disclose those details as well in this section of the OSP. International sections. While it may seem exotic to ship your grain to Canada or Europe or Japan, these are actually huge buyers of organic American grain. If this is a potential market for you or your clients, you're going to want to fill out this section and confirm whether Chilean nitrate is used on the farm. Chilean nitrate, also called sodium nitrate, is the main fertilizer difference of an allowed material between Canada and what is allowed in America. Soil fertility. Now, I've said a time or two that 205, 203 of the standards is my favorite section because of the focus on soil health. In this section of the OSP, you fill out as many details about your soil fertility program as possible, including how you manage your soils, how you build your soil fertility, and how you prevent erosion. So let's look at it. The first question asks, check the major components of your soil building crop nutrient management program. A couple of options are that we use crop rotation, so we're going to check that. Cover crops, check that. And that we use some minerals, check that. The next question, check the issues addressed by your soil management and rotation practices. We address nutrient deficiencies. We're going to check that. We manage our diseases and excessive nutrients. Check that. We manage a pH of our soil and the salinity, soil structure, water availability. All of these are options to describe our program. So we're going to check the ones that apply. Next, check the practices that monitor the effectiveness of your soil management and rotation practices. We're going to say that we observe our crops. We're going to maybe do some crop quality tests. We're going to do some plant tissue tests, and ultimately observe, look at our soil, see how it's doing, and possibly do some soil tests. How often do we do these practices? Typically about weekly, but it's really as needed. Then number 5, what monitoring records do we keep? And this is where we talk about all the records we might keep to describe this practice. So I'm going to keep my records on a calendar, remind me what date I did things, in a journal log, a more descriptive flow, and then I'm also going to hold on to those test results that I get about the soil, the plant tissue, etc. I also keep all of this in a PDF format electronically, so I have a nice, easy place to store it. Crop rotation. The crop rotation section is your chance to list out all of the potential rotations. The key thing all certifiers are looking for here is that you're not growing the same annual crop back-to-back 2 years or more in a row, and are rotating nitrogen-feeding crops with nitrogen-fixing crops. So let's take a look. Section D, crop rotation. The producer must implement a crop rotation, including but not limited to sod, cover crops, green manures, and catch crops. That's 205, 205 of the standards. So the first question, question 1, describe your crop rotation plan and goals. And so I'm going to say, my plan is to build organic matter, provide nitrogen to my grain crops, and ultimately control weeds, disease, and pests. So question 2, list the sequence and frequency of your crops, cover crops, and green manures. So I said we start with a rotation of 3 years of alfalfa and follow it up by a year of corn, and we're going to plant some rye for a cover after that. And then we go into our soybeans, our no-till soybeans, and then we terminate that and our wheat with maybe some underseeded rye or underseeded clover. And then we're back into oats and alfalfa. So we're showing that we have a nitrogen feeding crop to a nitrogen fixing crop. We've got another cereal over to a legume. And so our certifier can see that we're building our soils with our crop rotation. Do you have major soil deficiencies on your farming operation is the next question. If yes, please describe the deficiencies. Yeah, I mean, we always need nitrogen. We're always short on nitrogen. And so we're trying to grow our own nitrogen as much as we can by growing as many legumes as possible. 4, check the tillage practices that you implement on your operation. Now we do minimum till. It's time, steel, and fuel whenever you go through a field, so we want to do less of it if we can. Moisture monitoring prior to tillage. We're going to be limited in moisture no matter where you are, and so you want to make sure you're actually controlling for that. Shallow tillage. Some other options are contour farming, which is definitely an option when you're doing hilly farming. Permanent cover crops, no-till. All of these are things that we want to check and possibly can. Then number 5, check the tillage equipment used on your farm. So we're going to check we have a chisel plow, a cultivator, a disc, a harrow, a mold board. Other options are rototiller, rotavator, spader, weed badger. So you might want to check any of those that apply to your operation. Manure and compost. Manure is going to be part of every farm's fertility plan. Whether it's aged, liquid, from grazing livestock, or brought in pelletized, manure needs to be carefully described due to the food safety concerns for your food-grade grains. To sell crops as organic, raw, uncomposted manure cannot be applied less than 90 days before harvest. Additionally, all manure and compost must be verified to be free from any prohibited materials, such as deodorants or other synthetic substances. So let's go through this section. Manure and compost, we're looking at section 205, 203C of the standards. Is manure applied in any form? Yeah, we can use manure. Is manure applied to land used for crops intended for human consumption? Yes, I'm going to be selling my wheat as food grade, hopefully. 3. If you grow crops for human consumption, do you apply manure to those crops whose edible portions directly contact the soil, no less than 120 days before harvest? Not applicable. When we talk about edible portions, all grain is going to be growing off the ground. Edible portions touching the ground would be things like potatoes or squash. If you grow crops for human consumption, do you apply manures to those crops whose edible portion does not directly contact the soil? Yes, we do, like wheat. So I grow milling wheat as well as barley for malt, is what I write here. Is manure applied by grazing? Yes. What are your grazing periods? The goal here is for them asking, when are you going to be grazing and how does it relate to your harvest? I'm not going to be grazing when my wheat is growing, so I'm going to say October 1st through March 1st. Then we say, check all forms of animal manure that you use. Raw, processed, aged, uncomposted, liquid, or composted. We just use raw, uncomposted manure. If off-farm manure is used, where do we get it? We do get some from the feedlot over on our neighbor's place, the Ridgetop Ranch. And it's just from their bedded pack. So any associated practices with that manure production should be described in this section as well. Really, it's just straw and manure that they scrape out and we pick up with our wagons. Please describe your manure management as follows. If we're using bedding, well, how do we take care of it? So we pretty much bring on the manure when we're ready to apply it. We don't store a lot. If you do store, you need to be extra careful to make sure that you don't have any leachets going around the fields, possibly contaminated your food grade grain. Do we maintain records verifying that compost production meets NOP 205, 203, C1, and 2? Compost is very specifically described in the organic standards, and we have to make sure that we're in compliance with how they describe the making process to be conducted in order to qualify as compost. Compost essentially allows us to go through a heating process, which then we can apply the compost on food-grade grains sooner than 90 days before harvest. Typically, we won't want to do that, but you never know. So if you're going to make compost, make sure you follow the standards very closely. Seeds. Seeds will be one of the most important sections you complete in the OSP because it'll be one of the most active. It's likely you're going to use different seeds from different suppliers every single year. The big takeaway in the seed section of the OSP is that the producer needs to use certified organic seed whenever possible. If no organic seed is available, then a non-organic, non-GMO, non-treated seed may be used if the producers documented that they contacted 3 known suppliers of organic seed and none of them had the seed in a commercial quantity or quality that the producer needed. All seed inoculants and treatments must be approved for organic use. I can't count the number of times I've seen folks kicked out of organic certification because they purchased and planted seeds without thinking about whether it's treated or its GMO status. Planting GMO or treated seed will start the transition period of a piece of ground all the way back to the beginning. So let's go through it. In the first question, they're asking us, please check all sources of seed that we plan to use. So we plan to use certified organic seed, which we purchase. We're going to use certified organic seed that we save on farm from some of our small grains. We also are going to use some non-organic, untreated seed, yellow peas to be specific. Now, if you use non-treated seed or planting stock, how do you determine that an organic equivalent is not available? I write, we call 3 seed houses, including Golden Harvest, Albert Lee, and Wild Horse Seeds, and we document whether or not they have a variety that has the qualities we're looking for. Next question, what method is used to determine if the seed is not genetically modified? we're going to have to collect a seed supplier document as well as a statement that the variety is not GMO. And so for our wheat, there's no GMO wheat yet, so we're going to be able to have an easy go for that. But we do need to get an affidavit from the seed supplier on our corn to make sure that it's not GMO. If non-organic seed or planting stock is used, how do you document that each of these is not genetically modified? Similar to our non-treated, we're going to look at a GMO affidavit from the supplier. Do you use treated or coated seed? On our alfalfa, we are going to use an organic inoculant, so we're going to click inoculant. There will be some sections of the OSP that are just not applicable. To a farm that only raises forages and grains, like our example farm, we're probably going to be able to click NA on the vegetable, herb, and tree fruit section. Additionally, for the greenhouse or high tunnel production, we're probably going to click NA as well. In the next section, we're going to be asked to list every single non-organic seed so that the certifier can verify and check out if it is problematic for us. So here I list that I'm buying Alzada durum for wild horse seeds. It's untreated. That's all the information we need. On the next one, peas, they're going to be yellow. I do buy them from Albert Lee, but those are also not organic. So we need to be able to show that we have collected all the duly informing information. Materials. The material list is going to be another very active part of your organic system plan. For every material used in organic production, all details regarding the manufacturer and ingredients need to be disclosed to the certifier. Typically, this can be done with a label. This list of materials will be updated every time a producer requests a new material be added to the list, or every time they want to try to change the formulation of one material on their list. So let's look through it. On this material list, we have a pretty simple operation. So we use inoculant, the nitrogen gold. We show that we use it on the alfalfa and that we're going to be putting it on a dry seed. Its frequency will be once a year at planting, and it's for fertility. Also, that it's OMRI certified. And so the producer will be able to submit a certificate from OMRI showing that it's an approved for organic material. Next, we have diatomaceous earth. It's going to be used on our cereals. We apply it through the auger. It's going to be mostly applied at harvest, and it's also OMRI certified. These are the most important pieces of information to include because the certifier needs to give you the go-ahead to use those prior to you actually employing them on your farm. So making sure that they have enough material to go off to make the certification decision or allowance is going to be critical to keeping the process moving. Natural resources and biodiversity. Farmers are some of the best stewards of the land, and in the natural resources and biodiversity section of the OSP, it's time to shine as a farmer land steward. This section gives your client, if they're a farmer, the opportunity to describe all of the ways nature is conserved on the farm, from pollinator habitat to leaving tree lines standing, to birds and other wildlife that occupy the farm. How an organic farm maintains and improves the natural resources on a farm is a critical component of the OSP. So let's go through it. Sections 205, 200, and 205, 202 of the standards address this part in particular. The first question, do you have a current conservation plan with the USDA, NRCS, FSA, or other certification agency? So we do have an EQIP grant, and we also do a little bit of work with FSA. And so we'll just note that we do have some plans that have been disclosed to others, and we can include that in our OSP. Next question, soil erosion prevention. What do we do? So we have an option to use cover crops. We're going to put in some windbreaks. We have to avoid very steep slopes. We're going to keep those in perennials. And we're going to do some conservation tillage. But there are other options here that we could also be doing that we'll want to check. Nutrient cycling and minimizing the loss or contamination of a waterway. We're going to say that we use crop rotation, we use catch crops, we maintain our crop residue, and there's a few others that we could check here as well. Biological diversity and ecological balance. Beneficial organisms, pollinators, predators, native habitat. What do we do to maintain a diverse ecosystem? So I'm going to check that we use hedgerows. We have some raptor perches. There are natural areas that we just don't farm. There's going to be biologically diverse plantings when we have our cover crops. We do have some beneficial insectaries, and we have field borders that act as stable and static areas for wildlife to occupy that are outside the busyness of the regular farm activities. There's also a few others we could check depending on our operation. Reducing spread and impact of invasive species. We're going to say that we do work to contain and eradicate invasive species. We clean our equipment, clean our tools. We always use weed-free planting stock. And so that's a really important one, often a key source of contamination for weeds on farms. And that we monitor for new introductions of native species and looking out for invasive species. How are you supporting wildlife during the production season? So we can check that we have some corridors for safe passage along our buffer strips. We have staggered mowing and tilling so that we're not doing these activities during key reproduction times in the wildlife that occupy the farm. We have natural roosting, denning, and foraging areas, and that we manage our fallow fields and unused areas to maximize their utility for wildlife. There's also a few others that we can pick depending on it, and one piece that's always on every single section of the OSP is other. So if you have a very unique situation on your farm, describe it to the certifier. How are you restoring and or protecting, conserving natural areas? We're working to prevent erosion, so we can check that. We have a few riparian areas that we're protecting. We have standing and dead wooded areas that provide some habitat to small rodents, some predators, things that keep the ecological balance of the farm. We allow degraded areas to be recolonized to try to encourage native species to take over areas that we're not going to be farming, and that we're not converting really highly erodible areas to cropland. There's a few others here that we could check as well. Next, we talk about water resource management and wetland conservation. So a few of the options are that we grow water-efficient crops. If I'm growing in Montana, I want to conserve as much water as possible, so I think about what grows best in the environment. We should probably be doing that everywhere. When we're monitoring our soil moisture, this is a key component of you don't want to plant when it's too wet, you don't want to plant when it's too dry. So checking that as well. We might have some stream crossings or brush mattresses. In this area, we're trying to figure out how do we ultimately prevent our livestock, if we have any, from contaminating our waterways. We have irrigation, and so we're going to say that we use scheduled irrigation and drip irrigation. We also have the option to describe how we terminate our cover crops to maximize the water availability in the soil. In our operation, we do use irrigation, so we'll check yes to that. And we'll say the source of the irrigation. Irrigation source is really important because in a municipal context, or if you're running water through ditches, you may have a demossing or an anti-algal application of a prohibited substance in the waterway. We want to make sure that we've figured out how are we going to not contaminate our crops with that water, usually involving a shutoff period for our irrigation when we have the materials known to be in the streams. Good communication with your municipality and your ditch rider is going to be key for this. Check the type of irrigation we use. Mostly center pivots and wheel lines. It's all going to be sprinkler irrigation, so we do conserve quite a bit. Do you apply materials through your irrigation system? I don't, but I know that there are materials applied through our irrigation system. So, does our irrigation district use herbicides or fungicides? Yeah, they do. And so how do you prevent that from contaminating your organic land? I always have my ditch rider send me a written notice of when they're scheduled to apply those materials, and I shut off all irrigation 24 hours before. Now, this is very dependent on what the program is that your municipality or ditch rider is operating, but making sure you're, again, clearly communicating and having a plan for how a municipality or ditch rider is not going to contaminate your organic fields. Again, the onus is on the organic operator to keep contamination from happening. How do we confine or shelter our livestock so it doesn't damage the natural resources on the farm? We're going to say that we confine only when necessary so we don't produce a lot of mud. We have an area large enough to handle the number of animals we have. We also rotate livestock to multiple sites, so we're not just packing a bunch of animals into one spot that will produce a lot of manure and possibly a contamination problem. How do we control invasive species? We might use biological control methods, and another piece that we often use is haying timing. If you can cut the weed before it's going to be producing, then you're often able to kill it at a life cycle point where it's most vulnerable. How do you provide shade for livestock? Mostly, we let them use the trees in the non-waterway areas. And what monitoring records do you keep for all of these natural resource observations? So I do write down on the calendar when we notice things, when we do things. We also keep a journal log to have better detailed descriptions about the practices that we're experiencing on the day-to-day. If we have any electronic records, they're mostly going to be spreadsheets trying to track all this data in a way that's easy to digest. Weeds, pests, and disease management. In this section of the OSP, the producer is given the chance to describe what all weeds, pests, and diseases exist on the farm, what weeds they anticipate, and what are the practices, equipment, and material tools they plan to deploy in their effort to control weeds, pests, and diseases. As a reminder, all materials used anywhere on the farm for any purpose will need to be listed on the aforementioned OSP materials list. So let's take a look. We're asked, what specific weed control practices do you use? Some options are early seeding, some pre-irrigation, green manures, some other crops. Crop rotation is going to be the biggest one. Cleaning equipment between fields, and maybe the use of some faster emerging varieties. There's some other options that we could check as well. What monitoring practices are implemented to determine the effectiveness of your weed management plan? We observe the weeds, so we can click that. We keep records on what weeds we have and where they are so that we're tracking whether or not they're expanding and getting out of hand. Observation of crop health, are weeds impacting the crop health? And our equipment records. How often is monitoring done? We always walk our fields at least once a week, but again, this section could be checked as needed, depending on how you get over your fields over the growing season. And again, what records do we keep to monitor this? We do keep a calendar. We're going to keep a journal log. There are going to be some test results from the seeds to check, do we have weed seeds in our cash crop seeds? And then all of this is going to be aggregated in our PDFs and kept electronically. So pest monitoring. What specific pest control practices do we use? We have some traps. We definitely have bird houses. We always rely on crop rotation to try to keep pests at bay. We have some bat houses, diverse crops that we grow, timing of planting. All of these, and there's some more options, can be checked to describe your specific operation. Again, how often do we look? We're going to be looking for pests at least weekly, if not daily during certain periods of the season, but as needed depending on the operation. And what records do we keep? Calendar, journal, and electronic. Disease management. So disease management and monitoring. What specific disease control practices do we employ? A few options, and I love that we get this one again, crop rotation. It's the biggest one, the most important one. But also, we're doing some companion planting. We're trying to grow things that we know might make it a little harder for diseases to get established. We also plant crops like wheat on windier areas. If we're planting wheat in the Midwest, we want to make sure that we give it as good a chance to not get a fungal infection as possible. Management of crop residue, and ultimately a little bit of management via our irrigation as well. Describe your disease monitoring management plan. I say that I walk the fields weekly and look for signs of disease. I'll mark on my maps where we see any evidence of disease and write on the calendar a description of what we saw. I'll then send samples to my state lab for confirmation if I have a specific piece of plant that's looking diseased. How often is monitoring done? Again, we're taking these walks pretty much weekly. What monitoring records do we keep? Calendars, journals, test results, depending on what we're looking for, and we keep everything electronically. Do you burn crop residues? We do not. If you're going to burn crop residues, you can only do it to try to suppress diseases. Otherwise, we're not allowed to just burn crop residue in order to get rid of it per the organic standards. Split or parallel production. If an operation is going to be farming in split or parallel production, that is, farming both organic crops and conventional crops, the OSP will need to show what specific steps are taken to prevent commingling or contamination of the crops. Options might include using separate, dedicated equipment for the organic side versus the conventional, or identifying each cleaning step one takes to prevent commingling while using the same equipment on both types of crops. A quick note here. We're going to have a whole lesson later on about best practices for managing a split or parallel operation. So let's take a look into the OSP for this section. Question 1. Does your farm or ranch produce conventional crops? Yes, because we actually have some transitional land this year that's qualified as conventional. If yes, do you use the same equipment, seeder, material applicators, harvesters, on your organic and conventional crops? That we do. We only have enough money for one combine and it's used on everything. If yes, is the equipment cleaned before use on organic crops? Yes, absolutely. And if yes, do you document this cleaning? Absolutely. We want to document everything. When in doubt, document. What procedures are used to prevent the commingling of conventional or organic crops? We use compressed air to clean all of the equipment between conventional and organic crops. Our drill, our seeder, our combine, our grain carts, and we have dedicated organic bins and dedicated organic augers. Harvest. Harvest can be a key point of potential contamination, as custom harvesting equipment typically requires a cleanout. Furthermore, most operations who are split will need to use their combines on both conventional and organic, so describing how the harvesting equipment is cleaned out is key to filling out this section of the OSP. One note here. There's not one prescribed method for effectively cleaning equipment, and usually producers pick between cleaning with air, a broom, or purging, where the producer will run several bushels of grain through any given piece of equipment, segregate those bushels as conventional, and then proceed with using it on the organic crops. So let's take a look here. We're asked in the first question, which types of harvests occur on your farm? Custom harvest, producer harvest, or buffer harvest? We do all three. We're going to have some help from a neighbor cutting some of our wheat when it's time. We're going to cut a lot of our own, and we're also going to be cutting some buffers along the road. It asks if a buffer harvest occurs, how is it kept separate from organic crops? I write, all of our organic hay is harvested into square bales, while our buffer hay is harvested into round bales. The round bales are shipped directly out of the field and not stored on our organic farm. How are organic crops harvested? The options are mechanical or by hand. By hand would be more for produce, so we say mechanical. Is the equipment used on organic crops used on conventional crops? Yeah, we do have some conventional crops. And it says then to answer questions 4, 5, and 6. What type of cleanout procedure is used? We wash some equipment. We're going to use some compressed air. And we sweep out a lot and we purge a little bit. What type of cleaning documentation is maintained? So we're going to keep a clean truck affidavit for every truck that hauls our grain. We're going to have a cleanout checklist for every piece of equipment that's mixed use. And then we're also going to note on our invoices and receipts that the equipment was cleaned out when we're shipping. Are buffers harvested? Again, yes. And so if yes, what happens to our buffers? We sell them to a neighbor who has some conventional cows. If equipment requires a purge or clean out, indicate what happens to that purge. We feed it to non-organic livestock. Specifically, we give it to the wild turkeys. And what type of records are maintained for disposition of purged or clean-out materials? Also, we're going to feed it out and we're going to record that it was a buffer harvest. What types of containers are used? We really, in a grain operation, only use bulk trucks and wagons. We don't really have any packaging. Are the harvest containers used only for organic crops or other things as well? We only use our harvest containers for organic crops. That being said, we do hire custom trucks to haul our grain. So that's going to be a mixed status truck that we're going to have to clean out and document prior to shipping. And describe how we identify our containers for organic use. We use lot numbers, which we'll get into in the audit sections of this lesson. Storage. Where and how crops are stored is going to be key to verifying compliance. You will need to number your storage units, for example, bins number 1, number 2, number 3, etc., and show on a map where they're located on the farm or if they're off-site. You'll also need to describe how they're cleaned out between crops and if there's any materials used in the bins. Diatomaceous earth is a common pesticide used in organic grain storage. However, as with any material, you need to clear it with your certifier and make sure it's listed on your OSP materials list. So let's go through this section. It's pretty simple. We're ultimately going to describe what crops we store, what type of storage unit we're using, a bin, for example, and what its capacity is, say 5,000 bushels. We also want to tell the certifier in our OSP, is it dedicated organic? And if it is, that makes it a lot easier. If it's not, they'll be looking for cleanouts between the conventional stored grain and the organic stored grain. They then ask, do we have any refrigerated storage? As a grain farm, we don't. So we're going to check NA for that one. So one other section of the OSP that might not be applicable to most grain farmers is packing or packaging. This section asks us ultimately, what materials do we pack into, what form, what labels do we use? Most of us grain farmers are just selling bulk. But some farms, like this one, Meadowlark Farms, does do packaging. If you're going to get into packaging, you're probably going to need to be certified as a handler, which is a different scope than the crop scope we're talking about here today. Transport. How are your grains transported? Since trucks and trailers and grain carts are key infrastructure for most organic grain farms, how these units are cleaned and how that cleaning is documented is the most important information to track in this section. So let's take a look. First question, how are your organic crops leaving your farm or ranch? We're going to use a trucking company, and we also use one of our own grain carts to travel and deliver to local other farms. How do you ensure organic grain crops or products are not contaminated during transportation? We clean everything. We clean it with brooms, we'll wash it out, we'll also use compressed air to get all those little pieces out of the cracks. What type of cleaning procedures do you use? Again, air, sweeping, and we'll purge some. What type of cleaning documentation is maintained? We have clean-out records. We're going to have clean truck and equipment affidavits that we send along with the truckers to our customers. And we also will note the documented cleaning on the bill of lading. Check all marketing venues used to sell your organic crops. We're primarily wholesale and we are under contract to a processor. Otherwise, we don't really sell to farmers markets or retail or on-farm U-Pick. List all wholesalers, packing sheds, and or processors that handle your organic products. So we can say that we sell to American Mills on a contract basis, and we also sell some organic forages by the semi-load to area organic dairies. Now, record keeping. This section brings the entire OSP together, as this is where you describe how you record and track all of the practices you described in earlier sections. From seed invoices to material usage, sales receipts to cleaning logs, you need to develop a system that is comprehensive and addresses all organic activities on the farm, but also one that works for your operation. In the record-keeping section of the OSP, you'll describe what types of records you're keeping, the lot numbering system you're going to use, and how you intend to track your crops so that an inspector can perform traceback audits from sale of crops back to the field in which they were grown for every load of grain sold. So let's take a look. In this section, we're first asked to list what all records do we keep, what kind of format do we use. So we use seed invoices, seed delivery tickets, non-GMO verifications, receipt books, sales reports, bin ticket stubs, and a host of others. Do you use a lot numbering system? We do, so we're going to click yes. If yes, describe. So we're going to list the harvest year, the crop, the bin, and the field. Does your operation conduct internal audits? We don't usually. Usually we just have the organic inspection. But some, if you're, say, food safety inspected or you have another certification, you'll want to list those additional audits here. Next question. Describe how your material application record keeping system tracks all inputs, including fertilizers, applied to your organic land. So we're going to look at that we have a lot number which tracks the field activity records. And in the field activity records on our calendar, we list every single time we do anything to the field. Whether it's spread manure, or we're going to record our planting date, or we're just doing some field tillage. Everything ends up on the calendar. Describe how your harvest and sales record keeping system tracks crops harvested, crops sold, and crop inventory. I write here, we assign lot numbers to all of our outbound loads of grain. This lot number allows us to identify the bin, the field from which the grain was harvested, and from there, track all the field activities via our field activity log. Next question, describe the record-keeping system used to track the organic production from your farm to the sale. I say, we assign lot numbers to all of our outbound loads of grain. This lot number allows us to identify the bin, the field from which the grain was harvested, and from there track all the field activities again via our field activity log. Another section that may or may not pertain to your operation is marketing and labeling. On our farm, we're mostly selling bulk grain by the semi-load, and with it is included a bill of lading. That's about as labeled as it gets. But you might have a different operation that's more consumer-facing. So here it asks, what type of labels do you use? You might check no product label used, like me, or you might say that we use non-retailing labels because we package into tote sacks and ship them out for sale at a local retailer. List the names, labels, or brands of products that you market. And I write, I don't market. I just sell semi-loads of bulk grain, and we have a BOL and invoice that tracks the lot number. If you use labels, you're going to need to get them approved by the certifier if you want to call them organic, if you want to call anything organic on the label. Make sure you never use a label in the marketplace before getting it approved by your certifier. And that, my friends, is the OSP. It's a beast of a document, but the good news is, once you fill it out for the first time, you just have to update it when there are changes. So remember, fill out the OSP as accurately and completely as possible. Call up the certifier when you have questions about how to fill it out, and notify your certifier in writing whenever there are changes to the OSP. In another module, we'll watch a mock organic inspection to get an idea of how the certifier will verify that what's written in your OSP is actually what's going on the farm.